Sure. Well, and so let's talk a little bit about that and the protests, which we will, which you do a lot in your book. And I think most people are familiar with how in 2019, it started out as protests in a protest city, by the way. Hong Kong, likes to protest and they're good at it. But it started against the extradition law that Carrie Lam was going to impose, so that basically people could be extradited back to China with its opaque legal system. But then it grew into something else. And there were, at one point, perhaps as many as 2 million people protesting that. And then it became fewer people, but more somewhat radical, sometimes violent on both sides. The police increasingly using tear gas and rubber bullets, and sometimes even shooting some live bullets, and very virulently anti-China on the part of the protesters, and increasingly in the community where it spilled over. People would boycott Chinese-owned, mainland-owned businesses, that kind of thing. How much do you think of this crackdown, which came just a year after, during the pandemic, by the way, under the cover of the pandemic, how much do you think the protest happened because the protests became very embarrassing to China, and especially to Xi Jinping, as the rhetoric became increasingly anti-China?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question. And I guess it'll be really interesting if someday in a different China, we can have access to the archives and the decision making. But it was very clear by the end of 2019 that Beijing was going to move and move hard. And I think that's unfortunate, because even after the extraordinary protests, as you say, as many as 2 million people at some rallies in a city of 7.5 million people. And these were not people coming in from mainland China. I mean, these were really pretty much all Hong Kongers. It would be, it would be the equivalent, if you took it proportionally in the US, of something around 80 million people coming to Washington. I mean, it's just extraordinary how the city was caught up in this. And I think that China was counting on this kind of silent majority, what they call the blue wave, to back them. And back the pro-Beijing line in district council elections held at the end of November 2019. So after these months of tumult and, as you say, increasing violence on both sides, the election day came, and it turned out that, as in every election in Hong Kong, about 6 out of 10 people voted for the pro-democracy candidates. And it was an unbelievable sweep for the pro-democracy camp. And these were for the district council, essentially ward councilors at the lowest level. But it really showed community support for democracy, even after the violence, which like many other people, I thought would turn a lot of people against the protesters. So I think, rather than using that as a kind of pause or a reset, and it had the political situation and calmed down, and a chance for negotiations. I think in any open society, a government would fall or would negotiate. And, even in places like South Korea in 1987, very authoritarian place, faced with massive street protests, the government gave in to protesters, negotiated with them. But Beijing couldn't do this. And so Xi Jinping's response was to send down 2 really hardline, tough people to basically take charge on the ground in Hong Kong. And one of them was best known for breaking up Christian churches, literally physically smashing churches in Zhejiang. You send people like that in, and you get one kind of answer. It's a hardline answer. And I jumping forward a little bit, I'll just finish by saying, I don't think we've seen the bottom yet. The new People's Liberation Army commander for Hong Kong previously ran an elite and seemingly very violent commando unit in Xinjiang, hunting down and apparently killing people they regard as Muslim terrorists or separatists. So, you sent people like that to Hong Kong. Again, it was a free, peaceful, prosperous city, but you send people that are hardline security people from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and you're going to get a particular outcome.
In the book, you talk a great deal about the notion of Hong Kong as this very free, open, capitalist city, a place where basically people flock to make money. And anybody who's spent time in Hong Kong, sees that. There's other sides, but there's the gleaming, the huge office towers, and it's, until recently, very easy to get a visa, to get a work visa, very easy to travel in and out of Hong Kong, low tax, very business friendly. And the thinking in the years before the protests and certainly the crackdown was that even Xi Jinping and the CCP of today didn't want to give up the so-called goose that laid the golden egg, and that by cracking down on freedoms, they could be risking seriously harming or even destroying a key Asian financial center that needed those very freedoms, and especially the sense of the British contract law to survive. What has changed there? And what allowed that risk in killing the goose that laid the golden egg to occur? And I've wondered myself lately whether it was inevitable.
Yeah, well, I can't answer whether or not it's inevitable. I think there's a lot of contingency in history, but I think a couple of factors. It's a great question. One is from a macroeconomic standpoint, I think Hong Kong matters a lot less than it did in 1997. I mean, China is I think it's an $18 trillion economy, obviously second only to the US, much larger than Japan. And yeah, the flows that come through Hong Kong are important. I think much of the, technology, human know-how that's come through Hong Kong is important. But, in a relative sense, it's much, much, much less important than it was in 1997. But I think the more important answer is it shows that for the party, staying in power and what they regard as security is more important than anything else. And we saw that in 1989 when they killed hundreds, maybe even thousands of their own people, of young students, really many of them the cream of a new generation in China, and they murdered them in the street. And I think in Hong Kong, I mean, they've done it much more skillfully. There have been very, very few deaths, and none directly that can be linked to security forces killing anybody. But the result has been pretty much the same. And I think the party, when it comes to economics or Hong Kong as a business center, that's secondary to the party staying in power. And by the way, they've been very clear about this. When Deng Xiaoping met Margaret Thatcher in 1982, first time a British prime minister had ever gone to Beijing, a serving prime minister, and Deng told her the Chinese were definitely taking Hong Kong back in 1997. Thatcher's idea of continued British administration was a no-go. And she said, "You don't understand Hong Kong, and you can't run it." And he said, "We think we can run it. And if we can't and we wreck it, so be it. We're taking it." And so I think they've always been very, very clear that politics will trump economics if push comes to shove in Hong Kong. They hoped they could have it both ways. They did for a while. Maybe, as you say, it was inevitable that it wasn't going to last, but politics was always going to win.